The GTX 960, an entry-level performance card by NVIDIA in 2015. This was the debut for the next generation of the Maxwell chips. First generation being the low-range 700 series cards released just a year prior in 2014 in the forms of the GTX 745, 750, and 750 Ti. The main difference between the two generations of Maxwell chips is that the second gen had new technologies like MFAA and dynamic super resolution, but the actual graphics chips are only half the story. The real star of the show are the new cards that they released. Expanding on the previous Maxwell release, the then new 900 series cards were very power efficient compared to the last generation chips of Kepler, had full DirectX 12 support instead of the basic DX12 feature set on the 700 series Maxwell cards, and it was the first introduction of a 0 RPM fan setting for some models of graphics cards. That's right, the first time that the fans didn't spin on a GPU when it didn't need to was this generation. As for the GTX 960 itself, it was released on January 22nd in 2015 for the base price of $200 to $210. Honestly, a steal for this level of performance. Well, at the time at least. We'll see how it's faring today. Although it has a much lower price to entry, since secondhand on sites like eBay, you can find it for either $25 to $40 for the 2GB model, or $40 to $60 for the 4GB model. As someone who still remembers this card kicking some serious frames when it came out, that price was a little crazy to read. Is it a good enough card still, or did it not age so well and people just think it's better than it really is? So I decided to run it through my barrage of games to see how it's still holding up. The base card has 1024 shading units and 2GB of GDDR5 on a 128-bit memory bus, which that memory bus was considered pretty small on release as well. However, the model I have today has 4GB of GDDR5 instead. Same memory bus, but double the VRAM, which should hopefully help it out in the games later. This card has a base clock of 1216 MHz and a boost clock of 1279 MHz, although NVIDIA's GPU boost tech is boosting the core clocks higher in actual games. The memory runs at a clock speed of 1753 MHz, TDP is around 120 watts, and it has a 6-pin power connector. One more fun fact, this card and the rest of the 900 series was the first edition of HDMI 2.0 on NVIDIA cards. For the games, the system today is as normal, an i7-8700 non-K, and 32GB of dual-channel DDR4 running at 3000 MHz. The games range between 1080p and 900p today, no upscaling. Before the benchmarks today, I've put a bit of an overclock on this card to squeeze every bit of performance I can out of it. By running Unigen Heaven and seeing how high I could push the clocks before I encountered any instability, I got plus 75 MHz on the core and plus 200 MHz on the memory. All of the benchmarks and figures are gathered by running the GPU with this clock, so please keep that in mind throughout the video. With all of that out of the way, it's time to see how this card is still faring today in my suite of games. Starting off as usual with Forza Horizon 5, running at 1080p medium preset, we got an average of 51.9 with 1% lows to 48.8. Not a bad start, honestly. Medium still looks pretty good, and we didn't have to drop the resolution either. Still running at full HD, or whatever the word for it is. Funny that 1280 by 720 is called HD or high definition when I can't think of a single person who games that considers that resolution good at all anymore. I mean, it's alright, but at the time the term came around, I'm sure it was mind-blowing, but still a little silly that we use that same kind of naming convention to this day when we have 4K and even 8K displays. Moving on to a game that's a little more demanding, we have Cyberpunk. With the low preset 900p, we got an average of 36 with lows to 31. A solid 30 FPS result, of course with some of the lowest settings the game has, but this is without upscaling. I'm not personally a fan of upscaling on games, although I will admit as the days pass, it becomes more and more tempting to give solid try instead of just ignoring it. Either way, in this case, it's native 900p, 30 FPS cap, and it would run just fine, at least with a 4GB VRAM model. One more graphically demanding game with Helldivers 2, and at the medium preset, again at 900p, we got 34.9 FPS average with 1% lows down to 27.3 FPS. It was overall consistent enough that I didn't notice any severe frame drops during gameplay, although that may be a different story if you have the 2GB model instead of the 4GB one. With this card though, I got through a whole mission alright. Back to a game that's a little easier to run with Deep Rock Galactic, and on the Ultra preset, 1080p, we got an average of 99.9 FPS with 1% lows to 89. Maybe a little easier to run was an understatement, but it helps when the game is going for that low poly aesthetic. Even brought the resolution back to 1080p. No issues to report, the card almost even hit 100 FPS average. Doom Eternal here, hitting harder than normal. At 900p on the medium preset, we got an average of 69.1 FPS with lows down to 46.4. That's a little lower than I actually would have thought, although it's definitely running a lot better than my 750 Ti. It helps that it has enough VRAM that the game's setting menu isn't screaming at me that there's still not enough VRAM. And honestly, it still looked pretty dang good, so Doom Eternal not bad. Next up, we have BeamNG, and running with the normal preset at 1080p returned us 52 FPS average with 1% lows down to 44. Definitely a brutal case of that, I don't know, render bubble effect, where stuff that gets close to you suddenly loads in. And I know that's more like LOD things, but it really does feel like a localized bubble of good graphics and an outward world of not so good graphics. That being said, when I was driving, I didn't notice it nearly as much, and the game overall still looks pretty good, even on a low preset. Still fun if you're not attuned to pop in. Now on to Risk of Rain 2, where I had to change the settings around a little bit myself. Not that it wouldn't run with, say, max settings, but I wanted it to look good and run good. And with the settings I showed on the screen on the first stage at 1080p, with the artifact of swarms to double the number of enemies and hopefully put a bit more load on the card, we got 126 FPS average with 1% lows to 90. Definitely late game you'll see sub 60 with these settings, but on almost any computer you'll get that if you play long enough. It'll just be a bit sooner on this one. However, I think that this 960 could get pretty far before performance becomes a real problem for gameplay. And if it is, you can always just drop the settings lower if you're doing runs that extend into that problem period. Here we have Counter-Strike 2, and I decided to stop running the custom presets and just stick with competitive settings, low everything, high dynamic shadows. I've run a custom benchmark map from the Steam Workshop, and at 1080p we got 208.6 FPS average and lows of 132. Not bad at all. However, I know people also run with a 4:3 aspect ratio to make the enemies look bigger, I suppose. Since it uses less pixels, it'll get the GTX 960 to pump out a few more frames. And sure enough, running with the competitive settings in 1440 by 1080, we got 250 FPS average with lows to 148. The lows didn't actually move that much, but the average went up by 50. Again, not bad at all. Finally, we have Minecraft, and we already know it'll run well with Sodium and Iris without shaders. Lower powered cards, it may be a bit of a question, but this one we just know it'll run well. If people still want me to get the numbers of no shaders, even with more powerful cards, I can though. Instead, I just have the complementary reimagined shaders with the low preset 1080p, and with this, our final benchmark gives us 56.3 FPS average with 1% lows to 48.6. Pretty smooth frame rate, and although it's lower than the coveted 60 FPS, it's still easily smooth enough to be more than enjoyable, and it looks pretty good while doing it. And now with a little wind down, the 3D Mark scores. In Firestrike, we got a graphics score of 8280, Time Spy was 2435, and Steel Nomad was 319. This puts it squarely between the GTX 1060 6GB and the GTX 750 Ti, which makes sense when you think about it. Although that jump from the 960 to the 1060 is actually pretty big. It's kinda neat that the 960 is double the 750 Ti, and the 1060 is double the 960. A little bit of a trend. Wonder if the 2060 is double the 1060 too, or the 1060 3GB model stacks up. And that just about wraps it up for the GTX 960, at least the 4GB model. Maybe I'll benchmark a 2GB model one day and see how it compares, but I think that video will be more like 768p or 720p, not a 900p or 1080p video. But maybe it'll surprise me. The 960 today sure did. It ran most of the games pretty well with no super serious complaints. As long as you're at 1080p or lower and don't mind a 30 FPS game here and there, the GTX 960 is actually a pretty solid pick. Of course, when a 1060 6GB is just a smidge more expensive secondhand, on eBay I saw it by like $5 to $15 more, it becomes a lot harder to justify. However, if you already have one just lying around and need a quick card for a hand-me-down computer or just for a PC to play simple games with a friend and you find it really cheap nearby, the 960 is still holding out pretty well in 2026.